got stuff in here, let me, I gotta back up recording devices. Thank you, Jessica.
Are we ready to go? I will call to order the meeting, and we are not going to do the annual election of officers. Opening statement. Just to review, this is an administrative review, which means we're not looking at any new information, nothing that hasn't been looked at already. When we get to the part of discussions, please be courteous to everybody and don't get excited and, you know, let whoever's talking unless there's an active discussion, just good manners. So, we have a quorum, so that's good. The next item on the agenda is approval of minutes. Have you guys had a chance to look at that?
Yep.
Yep.
Second.
Okay, so moved. Communications, none?
You gotta vote on
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. All in favor of minutes of the last meeting?
that.
Okay. Okay, action on appeals. At this point, we will take anyone who would like to explain and lay this out for us. You understand that we are here only to evaluate the decision of planning board, not to discuss possibilities or alternative issues, just to see that they have done the correct thing according to our code. That's our job. So, whoever would like to start?
So that'll be me, at least to start. My name is Jason Dennis.
You're Jason, nice to meet you.
Yes,
I
Jason
figured
Dennis,
that.
from Hastings Law Office in Freiburg, and I am the attorney for the applicant here. And what I'd like to do, and if I veer off course from your prescribed procedure, obviously counsel of the board can say, no, don't do that, we're gonna do something different. But what I'd like to do is briefly introduce the players, so to speak, for the applicant, and then I would let Tony Donovan give a brief background, which isn't new information, just so that it lays the foundation of where we are in the world of being here today. And then to the architect, Tom House, provide what the design is, because that's obviously relevant to the appeal today. So the applicant is the residences at Bethel Station, and Tony and Jerry are here. Anthony Dunn.
Just to be precise, you're also, at this point, what you're referring to as the applicant is also the appellant.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, because they were denied, so they are both, as opposed to an abutter wanting to appeal it. So the applicant and the appellant in this case are one and the same. So I would probably refer to them as the applicant, that's just, if that's okay with the board. So it's Anthony Donovan and Jerry O'Connell, and Tom House is here. So what I would like to do is turn it over to Anthony for a brief background. I'll speak a little bit more, then Tom will speak, and then I will give some legal argument, because again, that's the administrative appeal portion of this, is to explain sort of from a legal and whatever perspective that you guys are willing to hear why we think there was a decision that should be changed. So, but again, at any point, if there's something that you feel we're doing that's veering off your path, just let us know. I may say something you don't want to hear simply because I have to, part of my job is to make a record. So don't be offended if I do that, because I feel like that's to protect my folks. So with that, Tony, if you want to. So he's going to just give a brief background.
Good evening. Nice spiel. Tony Donovan. I'm project manager along with Jerry here. I'm a realtor who's been engaged in the Bethel Station development as agent for the owners for at least the past 10 years. And I was involved a little bit in the 1994 subdivision, having to do with my interest in passenger rail to Montreal through Bethel. An interest I still have to this day, by the way. In 1994, the town of Bethel approved the Bethel Station project. The approvals included allowing for 45-foot building heights and a waiver for a 6-story, 85-foot hotel adjacent to the train station. Based on these approvals, the developer, partnering with the state of Maine, moved ahead in their investment in streets, sidewalks, street lights, curbing, curb cuts for bus transit, driveways, public water, public sewer, underground electrical utilities, stormwater, landscaping, and other development features that at the time were estimated to cost the developers about $10 million, in excess of $10 million. In turn, in a public-private partnership, the state of Maine, with plans for Montreal passenger train service, invested probably that same amount in new access roads, Route 2 and 26, train platform, train station. The developers built the movie theater, Norway Savings Bank built their office building. As agents, we brought the movie theater back to life, a new bowling alley was brought in, Dunkin' Donuts, and an investment in both the Snowman lot and the 3 acres next to Dunkin'. The town approvals from 1994 and the substantial public and private investment led us to this housing proposal that you have before us. At the time, the town of Bethel, when we started this, had just received an AARP designation by AARP as an age-friendly community, being a place where older people, communities, policies, services, settings, everything works together in partnership to support everyone aging well in community. One of the attractions why we are here in this project. From the get-go, we designed our project in a manner that would meet village and community standards, even so far as to get the blessings of Norway Savings Bank, which was a reference in the original documents for Bethel Station. We didn't have to do it, but they gave us their blessing for the design. We also sought and received the blessings of the Bethel Area Chamber of Commerce. It is our intent from the beginning, and it still is, to build a housing that both meets a need and is designed in a manner that will be an attractive gateway to Bethel Station in the town center of Bethel. Bethel Station has been, this lot in particular, an undeveloped community asset for decades, and we trust you will find that our design, with the modifications made to meet the new standards, are a contribution to the town of Bethel. Thank you. Questions if need be, I'm here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's a brief introduction. I'm gonna say a little bit more leading into the design, and then Tom, as the architect, will take over there because, well, that's his bailiwick. And so, as I was thinking about what to present to you all, I candidly, I struggled a little bit on where to start, because there were a number of different sort of twists and turns and issues with this particular application. So, I think where I'll start is chronology. There was some struggle with the timing for this project, with the developer, with the applicant, slash the appellant. And that is because in 2021, after they had their original approval, COVID was still lingering, and it did lead into some issues with getting started on time. One of the other issues with timing is when Tony came to the town hall to pull some permits or to get started with excavation to do the site work, he was told that the approval had expired. And it expired based on the date of the meeting, not the date of the written decision. And I can answer any questions about that or explain any relevance of that. However, the reality is that was not appealed. But that's one of the...
So there's conflict between the actual time that 2 years, is that what that's what I picked up?
Yes,
Hearing.
so they had the meeting in which they got the approval, including the waiver, the exact same waiver that was denied this year. But they received the waiver, they had their approval, and then the written decision came about 3-ish weeks later, maybe 20 days later. It was like the 2nd and 22nd, something to that effect. Obviously, I could give you those exact dates. I'll look through my files to give you that. But when Tony went back in, it was before the date of the written, before the second 2-year anniversary of the written decision, but it was after the 2-year anniversary of the meeting in which they were informed. And the reason that, for me anyway, on behalf of the applicant, that is an issue is using the meeting decision is inconsistent with at least one section of the site plan review guidelines. I think it's 140.6 that talks about appealing after the written decision. You have 30 days after the written decision. So the idea that the approval would start based on the meeting is inconsistent with that provision that says you appeal. And why that makes practical common sense is as an applicant coming in to get any sort of approval, especially site plan approval in which there may be conditions and certain things, you need to have that in writing to know what you can and can't do and curb cuts here and there, because that doesn't all come at the meeting. You can talk about all that, but you don't have your sort of blueprint, so to speak. And additionally, sometimes you need it for financing. You need to give somebody a written approval, hey, I can actually do this, before they say, yeah, we'll give you a whole bunch of money to do that thing you're saying somebody told you you could do. So that was the first impediment to moving forward with this project that already had approval is being told that the original approval had expired, when arguably it had not. Now, again, that was not appealed, so it is what it is. That's why we're here right now, essentially, because if that had not been deemed to have expired or had been successfully challenged, they'd have gotten some shovels in the ground and their permit would have kept on going, and they wouldn't have, and they'd have maybe had another issue if they hadn't reached substantial completion or any other milestones, but we may not have ever been here. So that's just one of those issues that they ran into. So, and as for that original, excuse me, approval in 2021, it was for a building that was actually greater than 35 feet in height, and it was a full, undisputed, unquestioned 3 stories. The waiver that was given at that time was for the 2.5-story requirement, even though at that point, the ordinance was one or the other. It changed to be that they are now both the requirement, the 35 and the 2.5, and that's obviously one of the other stumbling blocks in this development, this project, is it changed from one or the other to you have to meet both, meaning you meet the 35 feet and meet the 2.5-story requirement. So when that ordinance changed, the developer went back and they made some changes to the design of their project. And that segues essentially into Tom House. Before I turn it over to him to talk about the sort of design of the project to meet the 35 feet and meet the 2.5 feet, 2.5 floor requirements, I will just take a moment to reiterate that this was an approval that was granted in 2021 for the exact same site conditions. The site conditions have not changed. So in 2021, the planning board said, due to the special circumstances of the site, you get your waiver. This go around, due to the exact same circumstances of the site, they did not get the waiver. And I'll speak a little bit more about that as I kind of wrap up sort of the argument from our perspective. But I'd like to turn it over to Tom so he can explain the redesign.
Well, before you go off
Yes.
that, I'd ask my consultant to do it here. The timing, what is the exact definition of the timing that they're talking about? The 2-year, expiration date, I take it was critical in the decision.
It was, but I think, as Attorney Dennis pointed out, the determination, right or wrong, that was made by the town that the previous approval had expired wasn't appealed. And so I think as far as this purpose, it's outside of the scope of the board's review here. It's true, perhaps, that another application to the planning board wouldn't have been necessary and you wouldn't be here making this, hearing this appeal tonight, but that's effectively water under the bridge.
Right. No appeal was made, so that
No appeal was made, and so the right to challenge that determination is gone, and so you're looking instead at not what the planning board approved in 2021, but what the planning board did not approve this time around.
Yeah, just wanted a little clarification.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. I think that's background. The reason it is maybe a little bit relevant, I'll just say, is because one of the reasons in the discussion to not approve this, even though I think it missed the totality of the standard because it relied on hardship only, was that the applicant had created its own hardship by not starting the project in time. So by saying you missed a deadline that was arguably the wrong deadline, thusly you created your own hardship, I think is perhaps not a sustainable type of a decision. And I can explain that if you don't fully understand what I've just sort of said.
No, I would love to ask why no work was done in that 2-year period.
That obviously would be a question more for Tony and or Jerry. The only thing I've mentioned tonight is COVID materials and things were still scarce and difficult. If you wanted to fix a bike during that time, good luck. Like, you couldn't get parts. It was the craziest thing. You couldn't get gears or switches. I have some friends that are cyclists, but anyway, that's not relevant. Other than to just in general say, COVID had lasting impacts on construction injury. Well, maybe construction injuries too, but the construction industry. And that's not to say that people didn't buy materials, get jobs done during COVID. In fact, this part of the world, in New Hampshire and Maine, where I live and work, business was booming in that industry because everybody and their mother and their brother and their cousins wanted to move up to where there was more space and not be in some of the bigger cities. And so we're still kind of seeing that. If you have further questions in that regard, I would defer to Tony. Would you like him to answer some of that now, or do you want to wait, or is that how do you wanna handle that piece?
No, I was curious, I don't know if you guys had any questions
Not at this point.
Right.
at this point.
So I'll let
Yeah.
him speak to that, cause I did not even know.
Well, I was
somebody
curious,
at that
because
time.
I know some gentleman who has a construction company, and he had a rough time through that too, but they still managed to get their projects in.
Understood, understood. So, turn it over to Tony.
COVID. But there's more to it than that, because there was some confusion in our discussions with the previous planner, the planner at the time, where we were told, it was kind of backwards, that we could not get our building permit until we had our plumbing permit, town of Bethel. We couldn't get a plumbing permit without a plumber. We couldn't get a plumber without knowing the cost of the project. So we could get a plumber. So we finally did get the master plumber to give us a quote, and to sign the but whatever.
No, 2 months took.
Took 2 months to get.
Just clarify when we went first and got told that information was 2 months before the
I'm
January.
not sure dates wise, all I just,
Right.
you do know that we were told by the town of Bethel planner that we could not take the building permit out until we had a plumbing permit. We went down chasing the plumbing permit, and again, in the middle of COVID and doing everything we had to do, it took us a period of time to get it, and we finally got it. And when we got it, I came in under the gun, under the timing, and the code enforcement officer said two things. One is, you missed your date. And then he informed me, the previous code enforcement officer said, oh, you didn't need to have your plumbing permit. You didn't need to have your plumbing permit. You just had to take out the application, you didn't have to have the permit. So that, it's like, really? You know, he said 2 months, that was about 6 months in my mind, that I wish we had more clarity at the time, but all of us said, you know, you gotta get your plumbing permit for your building permit, that's backwards, but it stopped us from hitting our time frame. So I shared it with you, not looking for any excuses, we should have appealed it back at the time, but that's why. By the way, we were 13 days. I was under my deadline, but not the signed deadline. Does that help?
Yeah, was that discussed at the planning board?
Oh, no, because we'd already lost our appeal. I mean, we already lost our request for an extension or whatever it was. I think we went to the selectmen for that.
I want to clarify, Jason Dennis for the, in case there's only audio, Jason Dennis for the applicant. Do you mean the recent planning board hearing that we're here appealing, or?
Yes,
back
because
in-
that's the only thing we can deal
You're
with.
right. There was some discussion of the timing. Candidate, without looking back at a transcript of some of the audio, I can't remember the exact.
And I know it's passed because it wasn't appealed and it's not, but I'm just curious.
Oh, yeah, so I really don't want to misrepresent, so I apologize. I have to refer to the meeting minutes or the transcript, I apologize. There's a part of me that says, yes, it was referenced, but candidly, it's possible that I've explained it in more detail to you, gentlemen, than I did then. And so I get why you asked that question, and I apologize that I don't have a better answer for you. The reality is, as your counsel said, it was not appealed. I think it's relevant background for the basis of the hardship decision that was made. Candidly, you know, I think if I'd have been around at that time, I would have advised to appeal that expiration decision, because I don't think that's when it can possibly expire, when you don't have all the information you need to work from to like maybe show that to a plumber, for example. Here's what we're actually approved to do. But anyway, I'm gonna move on from that, and I'm gonna move on from that by turning it over to Tom to talk about the changes in the design to bring it under the 35 feet and to create a 2.5-story structure. So,
Any questions, guys, you got before they continue on?
all right, Tom, I think I'm gonna take your seat so that I'm a little out of the way so everybody can see there.
You're Tom?
Tom House, yes.
Tom.
Okay, take a record. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, and McPherson. Congratulations on
Thank you.
your additional quick position, right?
Currently, yes.
Good for us.
That's good.
Good for her, bad for us,
Why is it bad for you folks?
because she's so good. And she helps us out. So.
She'll still be helping you out, right?
Oh, well,
No?
Not forever.
not forever.
So, Mr. Chairman, what I've done here, I brought, I know you don't care about the last, the original approval, but I brought these here along to compare them for you. Can you see, sir? This one here?
They're both the
Friday
same.
the 13th.
No, they're not.
No, no.
That's why I want to make sure you
Those are
see
two
it.
different.
That's why I brought it.
Those are two different views of the same project?
It's the same view, same project, but it's a different facade. This one here was the one that was approved back in '21. You'll see that we have 1, 2, 3 stories, and we have the roof, the gable roofs up here. I won't go into all the details of all the other stuff, but this is what we had before, this is what was approved. What we've shown this time here, I respect the fire chief's notion that the ridge was higher than 35 feet. Although all the flat areas are well below 35 feet for him to get his ladders up. And that was the biggest concern that I think I got out of that whole discussion was, you only have ladders here, you don't have like a ladder truck, you have ladders. So the new design, in order for me to bring that ridge down, I created a gambrel. So the ridge is down just below 35 feet, and by doing this, my roof line here is, my eave is here, my roof ridge is up here, and now I have dormers in the middle. And that gives me the 2.5 story. In my mind, a half story, it was asked at the planning board about why half a story, because we asked for the definition of a half story, the Maine Municipality Association, MMA, I think, yeah. They didn't give us the definition, nobody gave us the definition, it's not in your regulations or anything else, I'm not sure how I can design by it, except for, in my mind as an architect, a half a story is a dormer.
There is story definition in our code book,
The-
and the MMA
There's no half story, what's a half story though?
just says what is or isn't a story.
What is or isn't a story?
Right, it defines, our code defines, a story. I mean, I've got printouts of the thing here, part of, it's under 140.12. It's word usage and definitions, and it defines it as, well, you can read, but basically if it's more than 1/3 of the total space on the apartment or building below it, it is termed a story.
Oh, I didn't see that in your regulations. It's 1/3?
Yeah.
Did you see this?
Right.
Yeah,
Because the
it's
council, I'm backing up, I apologize, just stop me if I'm wrong here. When we were at the planning board meeting, the council had gone into a definition of defining what half story is, and it's livable space. And it's between the eave and the ridge can be livable space, and that's a half story. And that's exactly what we have here.
Yeah, I don't know where that would have come from, but that's what we got out of the code book.
Oh, this talks about a mezzanine or a loft floor. These aren't mezzanines or loft floors. Mezzanine and loft floors, if you've got, let's just say you have one, I don't need to insult intelligence party to know what a mezzanine is.
I don't know, because I'm gonna ask
Okay.
my support in a minute here to
A
find out.
mezzanine and a mezzanine and loft is where you have, it's typically found in like mill buildings, where you have high ceilings. You have a first floor living space, and you can walk up to a loft that you can overlook down below. And that area, mezzanine or loft area, that's what you can do with 1/3. That's actually in the building code as well, not just your local zoning regulations. That's different from what we're talking about here.
So what you're saying, if I understand you, is the height there between the floor level and the roof edge was reduced by how much?
You mean the area itself?
No, I'm not talking about the roof peak. On the elevation, the actual wall height there, did you reduce that?
The wall height, I have to get, I got windows in there for the dormers. So instead of having the eave above those windows, now I have it down below the windows, and this ridge came down as well.
So that reduced the wall height?
It mostly, yeah, but not, obviously not the dormers. It actually reduced, this question came up at the planning board meeting, and I wasn't prepared to respond to it. And I think the question was, and I'm paraphrasing, it looks like the square footage, but they call it third floor, I'm not calling it an attic space. they call it, it looks like the top floor is the same size as the rest of it. And in presentation, it was. I have it all here if you wanna look at it. But in reality, because we have a gambrel look, a lot of that floor is not really being used for head height. You can't really occupy space. And I wasn't prepared to answer that question, how much has it been reduced on that third top floor? And I went back afterwards, and the top floor is 3% lower than the floor below it.
Was how much lower?
Well, 3%
3%,
smaller than the floor below it.
the wall height.
The area, sorry, the floor area.
Okay, over the area. But how high is the wall that's on the third floor of the half story?
Right,
I mean, what's the total?
right here.
Yes,
It
from,
would- it would- it-
from the
it would-
second floor to the third floor or half floor or whatever.
You want this dimension or this dimension?
The top one. Well,
This one here?
preferably both of them, so I can see the difference.
This, I don't know if I actually gave the actual dimension of it.
Basically, Reggie's asking you the same question I did, was
Okay, I
on
misunderstood.
the upper level, is the wall height different from on the middle level?
At the dormers, no.
At
The
the
dormers.
wall itself, not
Here?
right, yeah, from.
This right here is,
Right,
it's, if you compared this to this,
yes,
this here is down
that's.
the floor level, which is like 8 feet below what that is.
Okay, does it, you know.
Because this plate here, I'm sorry, sir.
Yeah, I
This plate
understand.
here is about 8-foot ceiling height plate.
Mhm.
But here, at this new eve location, it's at the floor line, or ceiling or floor line here. So it's about 8 feet.
It's about 8 feet.
Yeah,
to the
I have
plate.
a quick picture here. If you look, this is,
The mezzanine, yeah. The mezzanine concept's not applicable here.
That's the only definition we
Right,
have on.
yeah. It's like
This-
no definition for it.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just back up one quick second, I'll get back to it. Since you talked about mezzanine, this is better for me to explain it to you. Let's just say you have a floor here and a floor here. For this to be a mezzanine, I'd come out, this would be all open to below and have a railing here. This cannot be no more than 1/3 of this floor area. That's what the mezzanine below there means. So,
Yeah,
so
we
we're all, okay,
understand that, that's redundant.
well, I just wanna make sure, because you asked me earlier, I said, just wanna make sure, sir. You're gonna ask us here as well, so. So this here is now down here. So the lower eave that we're looking at right here is right here at the floor level. So it was up here at 8 feet, now I dropped it down here. Now I have a roof and a gambrel, as opposed to having it like this. My drawing's like a, instead of having something like that,
No, that's,
now it's down here.
my question, very simply, if I may,
Absolutely, sir.
is, this is a certain height here.
Yes.
This is a certain height here. Is there a
ceiling.
differential, or are they the same height?
This says 10 feet floor to floor, and this says 8 feet from floor to.
Okay, that answers the question. All right, this is 2 feet shorter here than here.
Yes,
And if you walk over here, you bump your head.
that's correct.
Okay.
So that, I'm just here, that's the differences. You don't wanna go way back in case you wanna know about this right now, so I'm not gonna, I only brought that along to show you that for history. I guess this is really the crux of the whole meeting anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't know if, did I answer your question?
Yeah, you answered.
Can I answer your question, Mr. Chairman?
We're getting there.
Well, I answered one of them anyway, right?
Once you get in, how far is it from the outside wall on the third floor to get into full ceiling height? How far is,
I didn't bring scale.
I mean, 6 feet, 4 feet?
Well, let's see, this here is 8. From this wall here to the ceiling height, it's about 8 feet, yeah, before I get into here. From here to here.
It's how much?
About 8 feet. I'm gonna say, I'll say 6 to 8 feet, because I don't, this is at feet 3 seconds of an inch scale, I'm just using this right now, so.
Right. So because of that, I don't know how many square feet you got on the first and second floor, but you've lost, but because of the walls going up, to build it similar to a, you know, typical story and a half here in town is, okay. But you didn't lose anything at all in height. The first floor and the second floor in the middle is the same height
As it was before, yes.
as the other floors. Okay.
I mean, this first floor here is, part of it is mostly common areas, like, well, it doesn't matter. It's more like common areas, like it could be a community room or an exercise room or something like that. That's a lot of it. So this, the first floor, you want the extra height. And you want the height on the upper floor as much as you can here, because you wanna have all the, your duct sizes tend to be larger up. As it comes down to the first floor, the ducts get bigger because you have to supply more air down below from the rooftop units. And up here, I can just run ducts through the X up in here with framework, so.
Now, is that third floor, is that gonna be units up there too, or is it
Yes.
part of the second? No, it's gonna be
It's
units.
separate units, not, so there's not, they're
Small
not
units.
mezzanines or anything like that.
Is that this floor plan here? Current,
This is back in 21, this is the old one.
do we have,
That's one of them.
Actually, you know what, Courtney, you're okay, you can use this here.
Are you sure? 'Cause I
Yes.
do have the rest of them.
Well, Mr. Chairman, what I've done here, on this new go-around, I didn't go back and change all of this. Like, what I mean by that, I didn't come back in and dash in where all the numbers were.
right,
I did not do it, because for me, when this comes down to here, I was going to floor level, which is right there, that's why I did it. I did not take into consideration, I did not put dash lines to show where all these dormers were. I admit to that, and that's why it came back. That's why I was kind of caught off guard when I asked the question, how much is the third floor attic level, how much is that smaller
Mhm.
floor plan than it is for the second floor below that?
But both the second and third floor are designed to be living space.
Yes, and the attic space is 3% smaller.
yeah. I was looking just at
Three?
Yeah, at least.
actual space according to the drawings initially, when I thought. Yeah. Any other questions, Dennis? Satisfied with that?
Sound good for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice looking building.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is.
I think they worked very hard to make it look like that. Jason Dennis again for the applicant. I'm gonna try to, as briefly as possible, tie some things together, answer any other questions you have. And there are really essentially two bases that this project went forward to be approved. One is that it meets the 2.5, well, I guess technically now it's that there isn't one to be met, but that it meets the 2.5 story definition or criteria, or that there's a waiver request was granted as well. So we're here to appeal both of those. So just because it's the most recent, as far as looking at the building, I'll talk about the 2.5 stories first. As a matter of law in Maine, of course, the ordinance has to give enough information so that an applicant can figure out how, or if they're gonna meet it. I think what you just heard from the architect is that given what we have in Bethel ordinance with the definitions and lack of definition of a half story, and it's not at fault for anybody. I'll give a brief example why. I represent the town of Conway, New Hampshire, and the town of Conway, New Hampshire definitely thought it could restrict short-term rentals from the residential districts based on the words that were already in the town's ordinance. The Supreme Court of New Hampshire thought otherwise, because we just, and when that was defined and created was before my time, and the words in it just didn't do what we thought it did, and that was fatal in that particular case. And so here, there is no definition of a half story, and we've just discussed why the definition of story isn't applicable in reviewing this with the mezzanine loft section. It's obviously also not a basement, which is also referenced in the definition. So we then look to say how do we satisfy the half-story criteria in a 2.5 story requirement? We got 35 feet, pretty easy. Get out a tape measure or whatever other laser device we want to use to measure that. But for 2.5 story, and how I know this is really, really difficult is because at the planning board meeting, there were 3 or 4 different, sort of sets of ideas on what that would be. One was that anything over 6 feet is a story, and that comes, I think, from the basement part of the definition in story, but this is not a basement. So that one cannot be right. This other one is the architectural style determines whether something is a half a story, and we talked about Cape Cods and gambrels, and lo and behold, if that's the definition, without any other criteria, measurement-wise, size-wise, this has been designed to significantly change the look and reduce the heights, and we've talked about the 2 feet and 8 feet and the different things that Tom just talked about. And so maybe that definition works, and if so, we've met it, but that's not the definition that's in writing anywhere. And again, MMA did not, and you'll find that NHMA and MMA both do this. They don't always, they will sometimes say, ask your town council. They don't want to step out on a limb sometimes. And so they did not in this case, because they did not assist with giving an actual definition to use. One of the ideas was that if it looks like it's 3 levels, or 3 floors, then it necessarily must be 3 stories. And, I mean, that has got a relatively okay common sense appeal to it. 3 levels, 3 floors, 3 stories, they're synonymous in some level. But, when you have a ordinance that creates a requirement, and that requirement is not defined, you can't just fill in the blanks with essentially 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 guesses. And then the fourth was it's not livable space to be a half story. And that just simply is not found anywhere in Bethel's ordinance and in a number of other town ordinances. We talked about other towns in Maine that have ordinances that do define a half story. Some of them define it to be not livable. Those towns choose to take that path. 2.5 stories, the half story can't be livable. In other towns, they expressly say livability has nothing to do with it. The half story can be livable. The only definitions that were expressly cited at the planning board meeting were from the council for the board at the time. And they were the Webster's dictionary definition and the Collins dictionary definition. And both of those definitions, and I have them in my written pleading, so I won't read them unless you want me to read them into the record, allow for livable space. And so what we had at the planning board, and this is not the planning board's fault, they only have what they have to work with. And they were trying very hard, obviously, because they, to a person on the planning board, presented a possible, almost to a person, a different possible definition. But that can't stand when you're the applicant, because you can't come in and say, how, planning board member 1 or 2, are you going to personally define this today so that I can meet your particular definition? Again, it's hard to come in and appeal any decision and not sound like you're being overly critical or critiquing. But the reality is here is we came in without a definition. We feel we met it, and it was denied based on not a unanimous understanding in the room of what a half story actually was. And it's public record, but in the newspaper, it's clear that there's no standard for what a half story is. Lori Windsor is quoted as saying that. So there's no definition and no standard. Meaning, from our perspective, if there's no definition and no standard, for practical purposes for an applicant, it has to go out. Not that you have no standard, because luckily enough you have 35 feet still, and it meets that. So it's a standard we can't possibly understand how to meet, and so it shouldn't have been forced on us in a way that the definition that is least consistent with our design is the one used to restrict this very beautiful, attractive building. And so that's really argument number 1. It either is 2.5 stories, by at least some definition that exists out there in the world, and since there isn't one in the ordinance, we'll pick one, or since there's no definition, it wouldn't apply, and so we meet the 35-foot criteria to be a successful applicant. And it looks like you have a question, Mr. Chair.
Well, I was gonna ask you if you had any comments on this.
I'm not on the board, so, personal comments.
Advice.
Well, I'm sorry to butt into your presentation.
No, I'll take a seat just for a moment, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I put on the spot a little bit earlier, I suppose. For the record, I'm Ben McCall, I'm an attorney at Jensen Baird in Portland. I'm here representing the Zoning Board of Appeals, as its conflict counsel tonight. I think Attorney Dennis has laid out, you've all read the written materials too, and I know he hasn't gotten to the waiver portion of his argument yet, but it's in those materials too. I think as the chair already noted, yours is an appellate review, and there's no debate about that. And in some ways, that makes your job slightly easier, at least from my perspective. What that means is that you're not in the position of playing planning board all over again. You are not in a position to determine exactly what a half story is. You're not in a position to review the entire application and interpose your opinion for that of the planning boards. What you're looking at are two very quite narrow issues, and deciding based on the record that was in front of the planning board, and I think up to the point you haven't heard any information that wasn't at their disposal, which is as it should be. You need to determine whether, based on the information that the planning board provided you in its findings of fact, whether it was correct in making two key decisions. One, that the building that was proposed exceeded the 2.5 story requirement that's in the ordinance. And two, and I suppose in a way, one is not necessary without the, they could be two independent bases to grant the appeal, I suppose. One would be to find that the planning board incorrectly as a matter of law, and applying the facts, the facts being the building that's been designed and presented to the planning board, incorrectly determined that this was a building in excess of 2.5 stories. It is true, I don't think anybody's debating the fact that there's no definition of a half story in the ordinance. There is a definition of a story. I think you've heard argument from the other, from the appellant as to why that definition of story, and I think I tend to agree with this, doesn't really solve your riddle as much as perhaps it should. What I can point out to you is that in its findings of fact, the planning board said that the proposed building meets the height of 35 feet, but exceeds the number of maximum stories of 2.5. And the only reasoning that's provided effectively is that the third floor has a very similar square footage to the floors below. So that in effect is the reasoning that the planning board provided, that this is in effect a 3-story building, 2 3/4 story building, if such a thing exists, but not a 3-story building, but not a 2.5 story building, which means it couldn't be approved. So you need to decide based on the argument that's been provided to you whether the planning board was correct in making that determination. Not, and it's based on, as you've heard, they were presented with a whole number of competing definitions, and they took a shot and they found that it didn't, and the applicant is before you asking for you to find otherwise. So that's ground one. I won't take the air out of Attorney Dennis's sails. He's made a constitutional argument in his materials. As a legal matter, lawyer to lawyer, I know full well that he needs to preserve that argument. If he doesn't present that argument to you as a board, and this were to have to go to Superior Court for whatever reason, he would lose any ability to raise that issue before the court. So he needs to defend his client to raise that to you. With that said, at least in my opinion, constitutional issues are outside the scope of this board's jurisdiction. It could very well be argued one way or the other at a later date that the ordinance at question is void for vagueness, that it lacks some other constitutional muster, but as a practical matter, that's not before you. So I want to set that one aside. If you find that the building is in fact in excess of 2.5 stories, and in effect that the planning board correctly decided that issue, there's still the issue of a waiver. And I will give you just, I will read you, I suppose, because I think it's important to know what, verbatim, what section 146A of your ordinance states, which is, of your site plan review ordinance, because this is the standard that the voters of Bethel gave the planning board to decide whether or not a waiver of a criteria like height, there's no argument, I think, that height could not be waived. And this is what it says. The planning board may modify or waive any of the above application requirements or performance standards, that being height, or special regulations in section 140-7 when the planning board issues written findings of fact which they have, documenting that, and this is the part to keep in mind, that because of special circumstances of the site, meaning the site where the building is being built, such application requirements or standards would not be applicable, that's one option, or would be an undue hardship as defined in 38 MRSA section 4353-4 on the applicant, and if modified, would not adversely affect the abutting landowners and the general health, safety, and welfare of the town. So, I'm happy to dive into the specifics of the variance criteria, which is what 4353-4 is. But in effect, the waiver, to grant a waiver, the planning board needs to determine that because of the circumstances of the site, that implementation of a height requirement would either not be applicable, and I leave that up to you as to whether that is not the rationale that it gave here, would either not be applicable or would be an undue hardship. And one of the criteria, the rationale, the only rationale that was provided by the planning board in making that decision, I can read you directly from the findings of fact that essentially say, Jim Bennett motioned to not grant a waiver listed above, which included height. As the planning board deemed the site does not pass the undue hardship standards as property could yield a reasonable return without a waiver, they have not shown special circumstances regarding the site, and that this is a self-created problem as the applicant let the previous planning board approval lapse, so no waivers were granted. That is the rationale. It would be up to you to determine whether that rationale passes muster, given the standards that are set out in your ordinance. So, I'll let Attorney Dennis finish, because I'm sure he has his argument that's just meant to be by way of guidance. And my suggestion for you is, once all the presentations are finished, I think you have two issues that you need to deliberate about, and ultimately reach a decision.
Review those two issues concisely.
The first issue, which is frankly determinative, is whether the planning board correctly found, based on this design that was presented to it, that what is proposed here exceeds 2.5 stories in height, based on its understanding of what that term means. If you find that the planning board erred, you can still make a finding as to the waiver, but for practical purposes, that would grant the appeal. If you find that the planning board did not err in making that determination, you're gonna need to determine whether it made an error of law in not granting a waiver from that requirement as it's laid out in the ordinance. So it's alternative ways for relief, but if not one, you will need to decide two. And Attorney Dennis can ask for you to make findings, I suppose, on both, but as a practical matter, if you find the planning board erred on ground one, there's an effect you need to issue or to deal with the issue of the waiver.
Thank you for that clarification, Bill.
Thank you. And so I will continue with the waiver argument. I think, unless there are any questions, I've made the arguments along with Tom House's points on the design of the building relative to satisfying that requirement. But I'm happy to answer any questions, and maybe if something pops up later, I can go back. Not a problem for me. But as for the waiver, the site conditions, and so, actually, let me go here, which is, site conditions, well, the site conditions are the same. The site conditions are the same in 2023 and 4 as they were in 2021, which is the soils and the ability to use that property, which has a density allowance of 46, yep, 46, 49. So based on the acreage, the density allowance for units would be 49. What they've had to do, based on the quality of some of the acreage, is they actually have to, they're gonna do some engineering to actually still, despite bringing it forward and going up as opposed to out and wide, based on the site conditions of what is geographically and physically there. And based on advice of council in 2021, if you look at the minutes then, and this was talked about at the meeting, it was found the site has special conditions. And so for me, when you talk about substantial evidence in the record, there's no substantial evidence, there's no evidence whatsoever in the record that these site conditions have changed. And so if the site conditions have not changed, then the lack of now I know it's a different board and it's years later, but the substantial evidence in the record in 2021 was that it meets the criteria. Thusly, you get for a larger building, you get your waiver to build this. When the ordinance changed, the developer created this. They got jammed up a little bit with that issue with the chronology of when the expiration of the original site plan was, but they come back and they present this. No evidence in the record of any kind that there's any different site conditions. And yet an alternate decision was made. And to me, quite honestly, that's enough to say that they made an erroneous decision, because they simply changed it based on different personal preferences at the time. And the motion that was made was on hardship. Hardship is not required. You heard the standard. It requires special circumstances of the site for which it would not apply, or a hardship. And obviously, if you only look at one, that can be, well, there's a further legal issue. I don't want to sound like I'm being aggressive or threatening, but anyway. So the issue was that they didn't have a hardship because they created it themselves. So I think that they do actually have a hardship, but because they can't get 49 units there, and so they're forced to get 38 because of the conditions of the site. There's also a municipal estoppel argument, which I think I have referenced, and I'm just putting these quickly on the record, in the inverse condemnation and a takings argument, because you're saying you can't make the money from this property, even though you put tens of millions of dollars into it, and now it's too bad, so sad. But I'll leave it at that, and you don't need to ask me any questions unless you want to, because I'm just doing that for the sake of the record. So I think there's a hardship, but there does not need to be, because the special circumstance of the site previously justified the waiver. And it's 11 less units than is allowed on that property. There are no fire or life safety concerns, so to address that point of the standard. And there was no findings that there were any issues, health, safety, well-being. The fire chief was at the planning board meeting and was asked directly, did he have any concerns with this from a fire or life safety perspective, and he said no. There was some funkiness at the meeting because there was a question and concern from the planning board whether they could, quote unquote, waive the requirements of the chief, because there's a new sort of standard in the site plan review that the fire chief, you can't waive the requirements of the fire chief. I think that really has to do with cisterns and water fire suppression, but it was sort of interpreted by the planning board to mean that he can come up with other requirements, and they weren't sure if they could waive them. And so what he said in his letter was that he's got no concerns with the height, but that it doesn't meet his requirements because it doesn't meet in his opinion, doesn't meet the 2.5 story requirement. And so the fire chief sort of co-opted the site plan regulation special condition of 2.5 stories, and that became his. And then even though without him saying that the planning board could waive it, they were concerned that they couldn't waive it, which I don't think that argument needs to be said here, but if that was the case, in my opinion, it's clearly unconstitutional, because the site plan would lose, the planning board would lose all ability, as long as the fire chief took any requirement and said, that's my requirement too, they couldn't waive their own requirements anymore. As long as it's not a fire related. But anyway, the reason I am belaboring the point on the fire chief a little bit is what the planning board actually ended up doing is they voted as to whether the requirements of the fire chief were met. And they said yes. So they've created an inconsistent vote. They've said it doesn't meet 2.5 stories, but the fire chief said, my requirement is it doesn't meet 2.5 stories. And they voted that it met his requirements. So they voted that it met the 2.5 story requirement. I don't know what you want to do with that issue, but that's in the record. And so, hardship is not required. But if so, we have one here. But we also have the special circumstances of the site from 2021 that did not change to 2023. And again, there was supposed to be substantial evidence in the record to support a decision. and there really is none, because there's no evidence in the record to talk about any change in the circumstances of the site that previously justified, the waiver of that 2.5-story requirement. So, in the end, the developer created a building that they say to you is 2.5 stories. We are asking you to find that it is, and that the decision by the planning board was in error on that point. But if not, you move on to the waiver. We stand by the fact that due to the soils and where and how the property owner can build on this particular site vis-a-vis the density allowance there, create a special circumstance of the site for which it should not be applied. I think that's really it on both in a nutshell, but I'm happy to ask questions, and obviously Tony or Tom may be able to answer some of those better than me, because they may go to their knowledge of the project or the architectural design.
All right, any questions on your part? Anybody?
I think it's pretty straightforward.
Well, it does sitting here, but the thing that's running through my mind is that the planning board was involved with the development of all this, and they had a lot more knowledge. I feel like I've been drinking out of a fire hose. But, is there anybody else that would like to speak? I would.
So you wanna discuss, nobody else wants to put anything else in on this? So we should discuss it.
We can discuss it. We have two options. We can discuss it now and make a decision, or I can end the meeting and we can meet again within 7 days as a group to discuss it, to get some time to digest everything that we've looked at.
One small correction on that timeline, just,
Oh, okay.
because I think it'll make it a little bit easier for all of you. The 7-day requirement, which is in state statute, applies for your production of a written decision after you have a vote to either approve or deny the application. So I think you have two options here. I think regardless of which option you take, it'd be very helpful from my perspective as the person who's gonna provide you draft findings to consider one way or the other, to go through the issues that you've heard tonight. If you have further questions or clarifications on those issues and you wanna make sure you're steering in the right direction, I can guide you that way. But deliberations on your thoughts on the bases of appeal that have been provided, which I just discussed before, the height and the waiver. If you decide to have a final vote tonight on the application, you are required by state law to put together written findings and approve those within 7 days. I can do that, but I found, this is my 3rd Board of Appeals meeting in different towns in the last week, and I've told this to every single one of them, and none of them have taken my advice on this, which is fine. For some reason, people say, oh, it's not a problem, we'll get back together, and then I get panicked calls from code enforcement officers or staff saying, I don't have a quorum tonight to meet the 7-day requirement, what do I do? And so the only consideration for you as a board is that sometime in the next 7 days, if we have a vote tonight, so probably next Monday, because town staff are gonna be chock-block full on Tuesday the 5th with election issues, you'll need to be able to reconvene as a board to review draft findings that have been put together, digest them, pick them apart, make sure that they reflect your reasoning, and then adopt those. That's option A. Option B is to schedule another meeting, yes, not necessarily within a week, but within a reasonable amount of time, where at that point, I will still have written findings for you to review, but you can, at that meeting, have both your vote on the decision, yay or nay, and adopt findings to that effect on the same date. I'm not suggesting you postpone that 6 months. I think the applicant would be reasonably perturbed by that, but I'm talking in a matter of 2 weeks, or at your next regular meeting if you have a regular schedule for that. It's entirely up to you. And if you prefer to just steamroll ahead, just be prepared to be able to meet. It doesn't have to be a particularly long meeting, but you would need to review and approve findings within a week.
All right.
If I may?
Yeah.
One thing I would add to that, from the applicant's perspective, obviously who is quite invested in this project, and so time is of some relative importance, is that there is some period of time after which the applicant could essentially deem you to have not acted and appeal anyway. That's my reading of the statutes and the laws, that if you just go forever and don't issue a decision, we can appeal based on the inactivity of it. Your counsel can advise you separately or differently on that, either in public or, you know, as an attorney-client privilege thing. But I don't say that to be, again, aggressive, same as just, I'm not here for any animus towards the planning board, just to try and get it right for my clients. There's some period of time after which, you know, an applicant who's ready to try and move forward on a project that's been years in the making, might say, well, what do we do now? And then that would be my option.
That's a point well taken. I think most of what I'm suggesting is we're talking either next Monday or we're talking probably the Monday after that. You know, that's all that I'm
Well, the
suggesting.
deferred discussion would definitely be, in my opinion, within a week.
I'm not a big fan of kicking the can down the
Great.
road.
So that settles that point. I can have findings available for you, whatever they are, for you. Is next Monday available for them?
I'll have to check the town schedule.
Okay. That'll be when you have written
No,
findings
right
available
behind
to
you.
you. Is that,
On the wall.
yeah, that works.
Next Monday, we'll get,
There should be
budget.
one right on the wall, and then there's one right out in the hall on the wall.
Yeah, should have, we've got budget starting Monday.
No,
No, we got canceled.
Julie Robbins is the 11th.
We ready to make a decision tonight?
And Monday the fourth is open.
Let me also,
I guess I don't know.
Converse with
You do hear me?
So they asked if anybody else wanted to speak.
So this is pretty
You're gonna have to speak up, Lenny.
Lenny, you gotta speak louder.
But if so, then we would at least come back to people.
There's no
So-
definition, no matter how.
I can clarify that process for
What
findings
story.
if you want.
True.
I'm happy to do that, but
If you would
And
clarify from what the board's perspective might be, that might be easier for me to try and guess what they would do.
yeah, so, first of all, it sounds as if the board wants to make a decision tonight, and that's great, so that'll start that clock. I would suggest, as just a matter of procedure, you've heard that nobody else wants to speak, and I think for clarifying the record, it would be helpful for the board to vote to close the public portion of the meeting, which would essentially mean, unless there are questions through the chair, that their consideration of written findings, whatever those entail, next meeting is gonna be, it's obviously a public meeting, it's open to the public, but it would be, it would just be the board deliberating on those findings and adopting them. So, I would, it's up to you, but I would
No, that's fine.
you can call for a motion to close the public hearing, just to clarify that we're done on that point.
Well, so I move we end the meeting and go into discussion.
close it for public discussion.
Yes.
Seconded.
All in favor? Okay.
So, cutting through a lot of the stuff I don't understand, I do know how to build a house. And the top floor on that is not a full story. We don't have a definition of a half a story. So, it's not a three-story building, so it probably falls under being a 2.5-story building. It meets the height requirements. It's, I guess according to the developers, it's a viable project. As an aside, more housing in the town would be helpful, but that's not necessarily a consideration here. But it seems to me that the planning board didn't quite get it on this. And I feel that we probably should vote in favor of the, I'd like to make a motion, I guess, if we get, after we get around to discussing things, to vote in favor of the appellate. How do you feel, Rick?
When did this 2.5 story come into effect? After 21, did it come in between 21 and 23, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So my understanding of this, to the extent that it matters, is that there was, and the applicant is free to correct me on this because they have the hindsight on this and I don't. I'm new to the party. The previous application, the previous project that you saw here was approved. Then some time passed, there was not, the project was not commenced. And in between the time that the first project was approved and the second project came before the planning board, town meeting voted to change the height requirement and make it go from an or to an and. And so, am I
Yeah,
generally
it
correct
was-
on that?
It was, you could, one or the other, height or 2.5.
Yeah.
So, for one reason or another, when the new project came back, there was the requirement that it meet both of those standards, both the 35-foot height requirement and the 2.5 stories. Right.
Am I part of the public or am I still a part of your discussion? Or can I answer
If
that
you have a question, if you have a question from a member of the public, you can ask it through the chair. That's fine.
No, I don't have a question, I wanna answer what you just,
That's, yeah, if the chair's okay with it, I'm
That's
okay with it.
you okay? 'Cause I don't want, other than you feel.
Or if it was
public
better.
again. As Council had mentioned, we got the approval for what you see on the right-hand side. After the approval, sometime, I don't know what year it was, Mr. Brown, but sometime between then, and I think it was January of last year, your zoning regulations had changed. Originally, it was 35 feet or 2.5 stories. Now, I think even the building height wasn't quite defined at that time either. From memory, I don't think it was. Because sometimes sometimes define it in the middle of the roof, or mean roof, like from the ridge to the, from the ridge to the eave, and halfway up, that's the mean roof to the average grade. But now, I think it now is defined as 35 feet to the ridge, which is why I have less than 35 feet now. And then it got changed, and then it says, it no longer says or, it just says 35 feet, 35 feet, 2.5 stories. There's no and or anymore. So you have to assume it means and.
Yes.
So it happened after the first approval, and that's why we're here today, because when Mr. Donovan went back in January to get all the permits, that's when he said it was no good, and then we had a new ordinance, so that's why I had to redesign the building. Pretty much says it.
From a procedural matter, you also do have a motion on the floor. That in theory needs a second, or doesn't need a second, but, I'm not sure.
I'll second it, just so we can discuss it.
All in favor?
Oh, of the motion?
It's a motion.
Yeah. I'm in favor.
Well, hold on.
Well, no, you've got to,
You want to?
No, you have a second, so now you can have discussion.
okay,
Were
well,
we in favor?
I'm sorry.
That's
And
okay.
this is my first as
Okay.
chair, guys. I'm learning.
Mr. Chairman, I'm chairman of the planning board in Stratford, New Hampshire, so I understand where you're coming from, so it's.
Yeah. You picked a good one to, you know.
I don't practice in New Hampshire, so I
All
never
right,
know.
discussion.
The one thing that I would, just food for thought for the board to consider, I think you've had, in the maker of the motion, an opinion there, and I think it's a perfectly valid opinion. What I would hope that the board would also focus on is, because you're not making a new decision, to focus on the rationale that the planning board gave in determining that this was, in effect, more than a 2.5 story building, and they said, and I quote from their findings, exceeds the number of maximum stories of 2.5, and that the third floor has very similar square footage to the floors below. So in effect, I think the planning board was making the determination that simply because, at least this is what their findings reflect, that because the third story, regardless of the architectural design, had a very similar square footage to the floors below, that rendered it a full story. And so if the,
To me, a story is not dependent on the square footage, it's dependent on the height of the walls.
okay, that's you're taking my lead, and I appreciate that, so, focusing discussion there, I think would be helpful.
I don't think it's a 2.5-story building, just because a 2.5-story building, I live one, I've slept in the half-story for the last many years. And, I mean, I lost probably, on my second story, I probably lost, I don't know, 25%, just because of the way the walls come in and then they square up. And these, I mean, they're basically not losing any floor space, so to speak, or any volume to their room. I mean, probably those up there are just as valuable as the ones on the first floor, so I mean, I don't. If I'd have been on I've spent years on the planning board, and if I'd been on the planning board, I'd have probably given them a waiver. But sitting here, I can't justify, the planning board didn't have a definition, and they done the best they could, I guess, to come up with a definition. But, I can't go against the planning board on this particular case.
So what I'm basing partially, when Becky and I were building our house, she decided we needed a second floor. And the exterior walls on the second floor have just about 6 foot of headroom. And Becky was 6'2½". And she said, we have a 1.5-story building.
Yeah, mine are only 4 foot.
Because we used to call it a knee wall in the old days, which cut off some unusable space usually, which is what you're talking about. On your house, you have a knee wall? Yeah, yeah. But, you know, to me, if it's not a full story, it's something else. And so it's a half story. I mean, the developers and the architects have made every attempt so far to satisfy the planning board.
They have.
Yeah. And I think, from my point of view, as a non-architect, non-developer, non-planning board person, I think that they've made a reasonable effort. It's not, to me, it's not a 3-story building.
In the last, evidently in the last couple of years, the town of Bethel, the citizens of the town of Bethel have actually voted to have that 2.5-story, or remove the or however it ever happened. It must have happened at a regular town meeting, I would presume.
Courtney probably answered that.
That was amended, on June 9th of 21.
June 8th of 20.
June 9th of 21, so it would have been a town meeting. in
Oh, yes,
21.
yep. That would have been after shortly after they got the original approval.
I think based on the history of the first go-around of the approvals, and then denying it on something that is hazy at best, undefined, I would tend to agree with him.
Tend to agree with whom? With
Really,
Lenny.
to support the waiver, and
To support the appellate.
yes.
Lenny, can I tease out a little bit about your motion? You did make a motion to approve the appeal. I think, based on the discussion that I'm hearing, could you clarify on what ground, I think I know what I'd like to hear from you, could you clarify on what ground you would be granting the appeal?
I feel that the decision of the planning board was inaccurate and precise
As to,
as to measurements and
okay,
definitions. I'm not saying capricious, I'm saying imprecise.
yep,
If I may, Chair, if I have the ability to request findings of fact, it may assist with the motioning and discussion process. And so I'm gonna be interrupted, I'm sort of not doing that, because I don't know if the wheels are turning to sort of send you the force to shut me up or not. But I'd like to do that. And so the request we'd like is that this meets the criteria for building height, which has a Roman I and a Roman double I, 35 feet and 2.5 story. And also, though potentially duplicative or superfluous if one is met, I do want, just for the sake of completeness, a vote also on the issue of whether a waiver should have been granted. And I know your counsel said that the one would be determinative, but obviously as I sit here today, I can't predict what all might happen after today. And so I would ask, obviously with deference to the board and any advice or recommendation from your counsel, to have, produce a finding on both of our bases for the appeal. Thank you.
It's not how you summarized it then.
It's not how I summarized it. You're free to entertain Attorney Dennis's request. I would say, I don't think there's any harm in you making findings in regards to both bases for the appeal. I don't think it's necessary, and that's the difference. My assumption is, and we can play this out, is that if there were an appeal of this board's decision, which, not to get into the weeds too much because it's appellate, would in fact be, well, I'm not sure who could appeal, but regardless. If there was any concern about the board's decision as to the height standard and it got kicked back, making findings on both, I suppose, would allow a court to analyze the case under two separate bases. I don't think, and parties are free to make requests about findings at all, and as a common courtesy, I'll provide a copy of draft findings to the appellant's attorney in advance of your meeting, just so they have everything in front of them. I will leave it up to the board as to whether you would like to also discuss and move through the issue of the waiver. Like I said, I don't think it's necessary if you're going to grant the appeal on the first basis. It's not necessary to give them the appeal, but they've requested it, and I think it's fair to entertain that request if you'd like to.
Would it do any harm to anybody?
It wouldn't do any harm. I think as a practical matter, obviously you don't need a waiver if it was determined that you met the standard, right? But if anybody finds fault with with the board's decision on that point, and you've got an alternative basis by which the planning board should have approved the project, that's insurance, I suppose.
So you're adding suspenders to the belt here.
You're adding belt, that's a perfect analogy, I like it a lot. Yes, you'd be adding belt and suspenders, and so, that's why I asked for clarification on your motion, because the board can vote on that, and then we can, you can discuss through the issue of the waiver, and I can draft the findings to have them sort of as alternative bases for relief. That's fine.
Sounds sensible to you guys?
But you've got a motion on the floor in a second, and if you don't have any other discussion, you can vote on that.
You should move the question, I guess. So, Mr. Chair, you have to call for a vote.
Okay. I have called for a vote. All in favor? All against? So I have to throw in the, I would say I'm in favor.
So 2-1.
So your first, see, Bill Allen, put him right in the hot seat. Now it was your turn.
Yeah.
So you still have the waiver, just to recap again, and this is not my meeting to control, and it's not my intent, but you've heard arguments from the applicant, and just to recap, both what the standard is and what the planning board found, and I apologize for flipping needlessly through my paper here. Again, the waiver provision allows the planning board to waive because of the special circumstances of the site. And due to those special circumstances, the standard would, and I'm adding this as I'm paraphrasing, would either not be applicable or would be an undue hardship. And I will recap, just for the sake of it, watch, I'm not gonna have to print them off. Oh, I did. The standards that are in play for undue hardship, just to recap, this is not a variance appeal tonight, but the four standards come from state statute that the land in question cannot yield a reasonable return unless a variance is granted, or a waiver in this case. The need for the variance or the waiver is due to the unique circumstances of the property and not the general conditions of the neighborhood. The granting of the variance or the waiver will not alter the essential character of the locality, and this is where the planning board focused. The hardship is not the result of action taken by the applicant or the prior owner. And so, that is, in effect, the standard that the planning board applied, or the planning board attempted to apply. And as to that, just to recap, they decided not to grant a waiver because it found that the applicant did not meet the standard of finding that they could not get a reasonable return if they didn't get a waiver from the height. And they focused again on the self-created problem as, and this is a quote, as the applicant let the previous planning board approval lapse, so no waivers were granted. They did also say they have not shown special circumstances regarding the site. I think I would just advise you to parse the language carefully of that section to determine exactly what the standard is. You've heard argument from Attorney Dennis that he thinks that the planning board misinterpreted how that should be applied. But that is the question, is that the planning board did not grant a waiver here because they determined that the property didn't have any special circumstances. One, they determined that the applicant did not show the lack of a reasonable return if they didn't get a waiver. And they also failed to demonstrate that the need for the waiver from this height, from this 2.5-story provision was not due to something that they did. And mainly, I think, you could speculate as to what that is, but you've heard testimony about what that alleged self-created hardship was.
Well, the applicant actually went out of its way to meet the requirements on that. So what you're saying is that basically there was a change in the planning board, and the new planning board reversed the waiver of the previous planning board.
That is the argument that you've heard. There was a waiver.
That's really not pertinent to our decision to
No, technically.
approve the appeal.
You are entitled to, take that into account. That part was before the planning board also. What I'll point out is that planning boards and boards of appeals are not precedent-setting member bodies. And so, technically speaking, I think it's two important things to consider. The planning board here, I think you'll find in its argument here that it found that there were changes to the circumstances, perhaps not to the site itself, but they did find that the applicant was at fault for letting the previous approval lapse, and so that would be a change in circumstances from the granting of the first waiver to the denial of the second request. There's no finding, I suppose, about any, as Attorney Dennis has said, there's no finding in the findings of fact about the physical property itself changing at all between approval 1 and approval 2.
So, are we done?
No, I think we have another,
I-
another portion of,
Oh,
we agreed to agree to approve in 2 sections.
okay. So, we now have to consider the waiver.
Yes.
So assume for the sake of argument that you have not just made the decision that you did, and that now the applicant is asking you to consider that the planning board erred in not granting them a waiver from the 2.5-story requirement. And determine whether or not the planning board's decision in doing that was legally correct, based on the evidence that was before it.
Oh, okay. Well, I still feel it's not a 3-story building, so I would feel that the planning board erred.
I understand that. Let me try and parse it this way. We're gonna set that feeling aside. Let's put yourself in the shoes of the planning board. You've determined that this is a 3-story building. And as a result of that, the applicant has not met that standard, but they have requested a waiver, as is allowed in the site plan review ordinance. And you are now being asked to determine whether or not that is in error.
No. That waiver was on the height, wasn't it?
It was on the story.
It was on the story, okay. So, and it was on this, the waiver was granted on this rendering, to your right?
Testimony, that's the testimony, or the argument that you heard.
So it's not applicable to the rendering on the left. The waiver that was granted was on the proposal on the right.
The reason I stood is I'm willing to withdraw my request for that finding of fact. It will make the board's night shorter and easier. That's why I was standing.
You have to ask him for permission.
Well, there hasn't actually, in fact, been a motion on the floor, so so what you've heard from the applicant, which is appreciated, is that they are, I'm not gonna speak for you, but I wanna just clarify for the board, that on the record, you have approved the appeal as to the denial of the site plan approval regarding the 2.5 stories. You found that the planning board erred as a matter of law in determining that this was in excess of a 2.5-story building. That would grant the appeal and allow the approval to be approved. I think the applicant has now said that to put it roughly, that's good enough for them. And what the findings would reflect at that point is that because of that decision, you decided not to, you deemed that the second basis for appeal was unnecessary and was effectively mooted.
Makes sense to me.
Okay. If that's what you're asking for, I'm perfectly comfortable with that, but I
So I'll
want.
just say for the record, Jason Dennis for the applicant, and I would ratify the way that the council for the board presented our position to remove that from consideration.
So do we need a motion here to
I think
ignore
that,
the waiver requirement,
we're all
or we
right.
just forget about it?
No, I think, I'm sad, that you've made it a vote to approve the appeal. And it's you've made that motion in a way that's determinative, so
we're all set.
I think you're all set. I think without really cutting to the chase, I think you've concluded the appeal, and you don't have any other business on your agenda, so.
Because the original waiver was put together. All right. So we don't have to consider that.
Can we figure out a day and time just to get that set? Monday is open, the budget meeting is canceled.
I am open,
Which Monday?
Next
March
Monday,
4th.
March
Next
4th.
Monday?
Yep. It won't be very long, I don't.
Yeah.
I don't plan to be here unless you really like me. What I typically do is I'll circulate the draft findings to the applicant and to the board, or to Courtney to send to you at that meeting. And I'll include instructions in my email, but essentially you'll review those findings to make sure that it squares with the reasoning that you provided on the record tonight. And then you can, and you're encouraged to make changes, and you can approve the findings either as written or as amended at your meeting. Once they're amended as necessary, you can authorize, it'll be included in their authorization for the chair to sign on behalf of the board. Those get distributed to the applicant, and your job is done.
you want to come back to Bethel?
Happy to, anytime, anytime.
Just be by the
It's
phone.
not this
Yep.
one.
Yep.
I'm good Monday.
Is there a specific time? I mean,
It also doesn't have to be at 5.
I was gonna say, I know you still,
I haven't
Work.
cut my prison tour short today.
you're what?
Prison.
Yeah, yeah,
They
yeah.
let you out on good behavior?
Huh?
They let you out on good behavior?
I have my own key. I got locked in one time, and no one was there. It was really interesting. Anyhow,
Are you at the office next
Monday,
Monday?
I'll be in the Berlin office till like 6 o'clock.
What other day is free for you?
I mean, I know Tuesday is voting.
Yeah,
I don't actively, like, do anything there, so I can meet Tuesday if that would be okay.
I'll have the findings to you by Monday afternoon at the earliest, and by Tuesday at the latest, if
you
that's
have
what
to
you
have
want.
a meeting to sign.
Yeah.
You have to have a meeting, a public meeting to approve the minutes. The ministerial act of signing them, so it can be sent out, can be left to your chair.
With some
But you guys need to
explanation as to
discuss
why
it.
we do this day.
Oh, okay.
Yep. You do need to meet in person.
I mean,
and
where,
discuss the
where are you
findings.
Tuesday? Do you work Tuesday? Here or there?
Tuesdays.
You all set?
March 5th.
March fifth?
I'm not sure, by the way.
Hmm?
What
You'd be fine.
We could do whatever time you guys would like to meet.
What time do you go to work in the morning?
I mean, you guys are retired, we could meet during the day, I am here. He's not retired. I mean, we can meet
He
during
has
the
a
day.
straw
Tuesday the fifth,
There's a straw
5
bag.
o'clock.
We could do that. Does Tuesday the fifth at 5 work for the other two board members?
Tuesday at
Are they
5.
voting at the,
They're voting at the Legion, but it is like it's a 8 to 8 thing, so you'll have time to go
Tuesday
after.
the fifth is five P M.
The office will be closed, but they close at 4 anyway, so I have to let you in.
okay.
So I will be here all day.
Tuesday, 5 o'clock.
Tuesday, March 5th, 5 p.m.
I can do that. Is that okay with you guys?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my schedule's so scattered.
Well, you just retired.
Tell me,
I
tell,
have to be in Sweden.
tell the chairman I want her back, please.
So I actually don't think they can participate in signing because we weren't at the meeting,
Oh, that's
so.
cool. She can come and listen.
Yeah.
Provide support.
They can be there for moral support. I wouldn't recommend that they vote to adopt the findings.
Yeah, no, because she wasn't wearing anything, so. Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
We need another motion.
I'll move adjourn.
Second?
Second? All in favor?
Thanks for coming out tonight. Hey, thank you very much.
Oh, these are,
Can you tell me that Bruce Sleeper doesn't come to the office anymore?
He does too much.
that was so much help.
I don't know if you know who Bruce Sleeper is.
So when you retire,
Yes, thank you.
when you,
So I was on the Portland zoning board of appeals.
Michelle, that worked out actually really well, because I knew that, I thought somebody had said today that there was going